Alright, hi everyone. I hope you guys are having a great day. So today's lecture we're going to be talking about trait theories. We're going to start off talking today about McCrae and Costa, and we'll pick back up talking about some other trait theories next week. And as you'll see, I'm going to contrast this pretty sharply with the individual ideas of personality that we saw from Alport last week. Okay? So this lecture, you do have an activity. It's going to be due by Friday at 5 p.m. Also, keep in mind that this third section of the class is the shortest section of the class, which means that we will only have one more lecture after this lecture before exam 3. So go ahead and start thinking about exam 3. Please feel free to come by if you have any questions. You want to stop by my office hours, set up an appointment, or shoot me an email. I would like to be a help to you guys. Right? So let me know if you need anything. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and get into lecture for today. Alright, so as I said, today we're going to be talking about the theories of McCrae and Costa, and we're going to see that McCrae and Costa's theory is going to be very much so in contrast with our lecture from last time talking about Allport. Allport suggested that each person's personality is very unique, that the personality traits that you possess are totally different from the personality traits that I possess, which doesn't mean that we can't study personality, but it does mean that we have to study personality in different ways with each person. On the other hand, McCrae and Costa and other trait theorists that we're going to discuss, they were basically assuming that there are a certain number, specifically here 5, we'll talk about some other possible numbers on that, but there's a set number of personality characteristics that we all have high or low levels of, and the combinations of those are what leads to our personality. So they would suggest that we can do a large-scale study on personality because essentially we all have the same basic traits, just we're high or low on them. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to start off our discussion with a brief overview of factor analysis and talk about how they came up with these particular 5 traits. Now, as far as the number of personality traits go, it's very difficult for us to pinpoint exactly how many personality traits exist. There have been some theorists who suggest, like Cattell, for example, we're not going to have time to talk about him this semester, but he would suggest that there are many factors, upwards of 16 factors of your personality, basically personality characteristics. McCrae and Costa suggested that there were 5 theories, 5 factors here. Different people have different numbers, but the idea is that there's a set number of traits, and then we're all going to possess the same traits, whether we be high or low on them, and so then we can do research on groups of people related to personality, according to trait theorists. So, to understand trait theory, we have to have a brief overview of factor analysis. Now, I do not expect you to know in great detail about factor analysis. This is not a statistics class, but I do want you to have a general idea of how this works so that you can understand how McCrae and Costa came up with their 5 traits. So, before we can talk about factor analysis, I want to make sure that we understand correlations because this is going to be very important to the concept of factor analysis. So, if 2 things are co-related, so they're correlated, it means that they go together, right? We know that those 2 variables very often go together. Now, that doesn't mean that variable A caused variable B, or that variable B caused variable A. It just means that they are frequently found together. So we measure correlations using a correlation coefficient. The higher the number, the stronger the correlation, the more likely it is that these 2 things go together. So what McCrae and Costa did was they looked at all of the possible personality measures that already existed. And they wanted to know, even though all of these different personality measures are supposed to be measuring different things, maybe some of these personality characteristics are getting at the same thing. Maybe there's an underlying factor that causes several different related personality characteristics. So let me give you an example. Let's imagine that someone had a very high level of anxiety on a particular measure. That person also had a very high level of insecurity on a measure on relationships. We could then say, okay, well, there's a strong correlation between people's level of anxiety and their insecurity in relationships. So I wonder if those 2 things are actually separate things, or I wonder if they're really going together and they're really being influenced by something deeper, maybe an underlying personality trait that then causes that person to be insecure and causes them to be anxious, right? Maybe if someone ends up scoring very high on a measure of like social, enjoying being around other people, and they also measure very strongly on a measure about affection or a measure about enjoying talking to other people, we could say, well, maybe there's something that's underlying all of these factors, right? These factors seem to be correlated with each other. So people who rate high on affection usually also say they like being around people, usually also say they like to talk a lot, right? Maybe there's an underlying personality characteristic that's causing all of those things, right? So basically what they did was they took people's results on a wide variety of personality tests. They ran statistics on them to try to find underlying factors, those specific traits that these all clustered around or that they all seemed related to, right? And we're going to talk about the 5 traits that they ended up deciding. Basically, they said all of these other personality measures are getting at 5 basic things. Based on their statistics, they decided there were 5. Now, some people have said more, some people say less, but 5 is a pretty good number. We're going to see that a lot of people do, at least in part, adhere to this way of thinking. Now, when we come up with these traits, these personality traits, we do need to make a distinction between unipolar traits and bipolar traits. Now, a unipolar trait basically means that you have a score that starts at 0 and increases as you get more of the certain whatever it is that you're measuring, right? So maybe if you think about like intelligence, right? We have an intelligence test and we're measuring from 0 to whatever the maximum intelligence test score is. Bipolar traits are a little bit different. We're going to be talking about bipolar traits today. McCrae and Costa's traits are all going to be bipolar traits. So a bipolar trait is basically the idea that we have opposing poles, and you're probably going to end up at one pole or the other. Like, for example, one of the ones we're going to talk about is going to be extraversion, right? So we'll have some people on one end as being extroverted, some people on the other end as being introverted. Now, you may be sort of close to the middle, or maybe you're very far on one side or the other, but what we see is that there are these 2 opposing sides of the same personality trait. Now, if we have 5 personality traits, and each person is going to land on one of those sides, right, then you can understand that there are several different possible personality combinations here, because some people are going to be high on the first one, low on the second one, and so on and so forth. But we're going to be talking about bipolar traits today. So trying to understand the Big 5 theory before we get into the 5 factors, which we're going to spend most of our lecture today talking about. The 5-factor model started out as just the attempt to identify personality traits. That's really all they were interested in. Can we figure out what personality traits are supported by research? That's where they started. But then, diving into this, it developed into a taxonomy. So a taxonomy is basically a way of classifying. I'm not just trying to identify them, I'm also trying to classify them, put them together in a way that helps organize them and helps make sense of the data. So first, they went and found the data. Once they did, it developed into a taxonomy where they organized the data, they classified the data, and put it together. And then, from a taxonomy, it developed into a theory. Now, we talked a little bit about theory at the beginning of the semester, and we said that a theory is a big picture idea that we try to support or refute, depending on what we're looking at, in our research. And we try to say, okay, a theory is such a big picture idea that we can't test all of it in one study, but we test little pieces of it over and over again to try to help us see how much merit we have in our theory. The idea here is that a theory helps us come up with hypotheses, predictions, what we should expect, and it helps us make sense of what we already know. So McCrae and Costa started off just trying to figure out what actually constitutes personality. And then they came up with some things, organized them, and developed a taxonomy, or a classification system, if you will. But we can also take a step beyond just classifying personality. We can take what we know now, based on McCrae and Costa's research, and then try to use that to understand why people do what they do, make predictions about what people will do in the future, as well as try to explain things that have already happened. So there has been a great amount of research that has come out of this theory. We're going to see that there's a lot of support for this 5-factor theory. Of course, some individuals suggest that it seems difficult to boil the complex human experience down into 5 personality characteristics, and I can completely understand that. But McCrae and Costa did a pretty good job here. It says they utilized every major personality inventory. As I was telling you, when they did their factor analysis, they started off with a very large amount of information and were trying to get at the traits that are underlying all of these different results that they found. And basically, they came up with 5 factors that they found research support for. 5 parts of our personality that basically all of the other measures were getting at these 5 factors. They were all measuring different aspects of these factors. Now, this is a very popular theory, in part because it does have a lot of research support, also because it's relatively parsimonious. It's fairly straightforward. People like that. Now, obviously, a lot of research has been done on McCrae and Costa, and they found that this model tends to be fairly consistent across cultures, which makes sense if our personality is at least in part like genetics, part of human nature. We're going to talk about this later in the lecture. Then it would make sense that we would find the similar personality traits across cultures. Now we're going to see that the way that those personality traits they're expressed is going to be different from culture to culture, but the fact that these personality traits exist in most cultures makes sense based on this research. It also seems to be stable over time. So at the beginning of the semester, I asked you all to tell me in an activity your thoughts on personality and whether you think personality changes. Many of you suggested that personality does change a little bit, but it doesn't usually change a very large amount. Well, that's pretty much what we found with these 5-factor theories. Basically, it's the idea that if you score high on extroversion, then probably you're going to be extroverted in the future as well. I mean, that might change a little bit, but it's not going to change drastically, at least not in most cases. So it seems to be stable over time, and it seems to be stable across cultures, which means that this is a pretty good theory of personality. All right, so then let's get into it. The 5 traits that McCrae and Costa found support for based on their factor analysis. We have extraversion, neuroticism, openness, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. So what I want to do is I want to go through these 5 factors. I'm going to talk about how they are bipolar factors, so how we can have a very different look on the 2 opposing ends here, and talk about how these are related to behavior, and then a little bit I want to talk about mental illness, which is going to touch on your activity for this week as well. So the first factor here, extraversion. So someone who is extroverted is someone who enjoys being around other people, especially it helps them to relax. So introverted people might also enjoy being around other people to a certain extent, but they feel like they need some alone time, some downtime to help them to relax. On the other hand, extroverted people often report feeling like they can relax when they're around other people. Maybe they don't like to be alone, okay? Now, other things that seem to be related to extroversion, they tend to be very talkative. They enjoy having fun. They're more likely to maybe have more hobbies, more interests, that kind of thing. They tend to be more affectionate towards people that they have relationships with. And we're going to talk about this a little bit later as well, but people who rate themselves as being high on extroversion usually also rate themselves as having good mood. So we'll talk about there are problems with, and we should at least clarify that research in a little bit, but people report being a little bit happier when they're extroverted. So then, on the other hand, we have introverted individuals who are on the other end of the spectrum here. These individuals still enjoy being around other people, but they need alone time, they need downtime, and they tend to be more quiet. They tend to kind of stick to themselves a little bit more, and maybe when they are around other people, maybe they prefer smaller groups or people that they know more, that they're comfortable with. They spend their free time in a different way than an extroverted individual would. Now, if we're thinking about how this is related to behavior, an extroverted person is probably more likely to go out more, to spend more time around other people, maybe to strike up conversations with strangers, maybe to make new friends and new relationships, right? It's also potentially related to different kinds of psychopathology that we could talk about. The things that come to mind when I first think about extroversion, if a person is introverted and they keep to themselves more, that might make them a little bit more predisposed to being depressed. We see that one of the treatments for depression is basically having people, even if they don't feel like it, still getting out and doing things and seeing people. And so it may be protective for people to have these relationships that may become a little bit more naturally to individuals who are extroverted, okay? So we are usually either on the extroverted end of the spectrum or the introverted end of the spectrum, okay? The next one is neuroticism. the way that I explain neuroticism to my students, because I know that neurotic is a term that gets thrown around. Sometimes people don't understand exactly what it is that they're talking about, but neuroticism basically refers to someone who's emotionally unstable, right? So we see someone who is neurotic as a person who is probably very anxious, very insecure. This is a person who is probably high-strung, right? You think about maybe the type A people out there tend to be maybe a little bit more neurotic, kind of your nervous, anxious person, right? So then we could see that at the other end of the scale, we could have the very emotionally stable, laid back, very secure, relaxed individual, right? Now, obviously, we think about this related to mental health. We can see that someone who's high in neuroticism is probably likely to be anxious, but then maybe likely to have relationship problems, that kind of thing. We actually see that research suggests that neurotic individuals are more likely to feel jealousy in romantic relationships, a little bit more likely to divorce, that kind of thing. And so then there may be some benefits here if an individual is neurotic, with talking to them, doing therapy, doing couples therapy, talking about how to handle conflict and that kind of thing. So we're going to have a bipolar factor here where we have on one end a very neurotic, anxious, tightly strung individual. On the other hand, we have a very laid back and relaxed individual, right? Openness, here you might also hear this called openness to experience. This is someone who is, if we're talking about someone on the open end of this, someone who likes to do new things, someone who is creative, someone who doesn't mind taking risks, right? On the other end of this, we have the individuals who don't like to do new things, right? They always go to the same restaurants, order the same food, and if you're not this person, then you know this person, right? I am completely the opposite of this. I am not open to experience. I am not spontaneous. Like, to me, it's spontaneous to decide at the last minute to go get a milkshake at 8 o'clock at night. Like, that's spontaneous to me. So I like to have a plan ahead of time. I'm definitely not going to be high on openness to experience. But some individuals, they're high on openness to experience. They enjoy doing things on their own, trying new things, taking risks, right? Now, this could be a good thing if this leads someone then to maybe take a risk that works out well for them, right? Maybe they end up starting a relationship with someone. Maybe they end up going back to school, making a good investment, that kind of thing. But we could also see that someone who is very open to experience could also potentially get themselves into trouble. Maybe potentially substance use or falling in with the wrong crowd of people, right? But we can see then this is a bipolar trait, once again, that some people are very, very open to new experiences, some of us not so much, okay? The next one, agreeableness. Basically, someone who scores high on agreeableness is going to be someone who gets along well with other people, just like it sounds. Someone who really cares about other people, kind of soft-hearted individual, typically likes other people, trusts other people. They're usually kind to other people. Agreeable individuals are the ones that are easy to get along with. So maybe if you've had an experience with roommates, maybe you had an agreeable roommate and had a wonderful experience, or maybe you had a roommate that was not very agreeable and had a terrible experience, and we've all been there and we understand that, right? But the idea here is that someone can be on the end of agreeableness where they're easy to get along with. On the other end, we have individuals who are very low on agreeableness. So this is the person who enjoys conflict. They tend to breed conflict, it seems. That they don't really get along with other people. They don't really trust other people. They are not particularly kind to other people, and so we can see that there's a range here, right? And then conscientiousness, this last one, really has to do with dependable, being trustworthy. So someone who is high on conscientiousness is someone who gets their bills paid. They have their stuff together, right? They're organized. They maybe make lists. If anybody out there is a list maker, I feel you there. They keep a planner. They make notes, right? They're organized. They make sure that everything is taken care of. They're reliable. On the other end of things, though, we know some individuals who are on the lower end of conscientiousness, or the opposite side here, where they're not terribly reliable. They're not very good at following a schedule, setting priorities, paying bills, that kind of thing. So we think about conscientiousness as responsibility, perhaps. Okay. Now we could see that someone who is low on conscientiousness, who's kind of all over the place, In some ways that might resemble ADHD a little bit. In some ways that might cause anxiety if an individual is constantly missing deadlines, not paying bills, then that individual might be under a great deal of stress trying to deal with the ramifications of that, right? So things to think about when we're looking at this. First of all, do you think that this basically covers all the areas of personality? Do we feel like being high or low on each one of these traits is a good description of who you are? And thinking about not just is this a good description, but also is this helpful for us when we're talking about both diagnosing and treating psychological illness? Is there something that we can do, like if someone is high on neuroticism or low on conscientiousness? Is there something that we can do to help them? So that's what I want you guys to be thinking about this week. So your activity is to ask, how could these 5 traits be related to psychological illness? And I discussed this some during the lecture video, but I want you to add your own thoughts here. I give you some thoughts to get you started. You might consider depression, anxiety, substance use, personality disorders. How might these individuals be more likely to have mental illness if they have some of these personality traits? And then how could you help them, right? We don't want to just say, okay, well, because you have this personality style, you're going to have a substance use disorder and there's nothing we can do for you. No. Once we have an idea, maybe something that's related to it or causing it potentially, then we have to think about how that impacts our treatment. So what I want you to do is think about how personality traits are related to psychological illness this week. Very good. And if you ever have any questions or comments, feel free to let me know. Come by my office hours, shoot me an email. I would love to hear from you guys. So we have this understanding that McCrae and Costa chose their 5 personality traits based on statistics. So that is a theory, but we need to talk more about the heart of their theory here as well. So we have these traits, but where do these traits come from? So when we're talking about your core components of personality, we're also going to be talking about where those core components come from, these peripheral components as well. So McCrae and Costa would say that we have these basic tendencies. Now, a basic tendency is the raw material that you're essentially born with, the personality traits that you have from the earliest age. Now, McCrae and Costa would suggest that your basic tendencies are usually caused by biology. So when it talks down here about biological bases, those are going to cause or be at least very closely related to your basic tendencies. So think about this. Some individuals have a genetic predisposition towards being neurotic. Some individuals have a genetic predisposition towards being conscientious or towards being extroverted. So if we think about someone's genetics that they receive from their parents, if we think about hormone levels, right? So some individuals are going to have, more instability in neurotransmitters and in hormones, and then that might then impact their personality, right? We see that sometimes things like depression and things like anxiety, OCD, a lot of these things do have a genetic component, and so perhaps it is impacting us because it impacts our personality, right? We could see how people who are not open to change and are very conscientious, they like things a certain way, might then develop OCD, right? Case in point, I'm obviously referring to myself here. We could see that there could be combinations of personality traits that we received genetically that then impact us, right? So your basic tendencies is kind of the personality that you're born with, which is very often caused by biology, right? So we start off with the personality that we're born with, and then we add on characteristic adaptations. Now, characteristic adaptations are basically personality traits that you acquire or that change a little bit as you adapt to your environment. So maybe if someone is in an environment where they're not having someone look out for them, they're not having someone take care of them, then maybe they had to develop more conscientiousness, right? They had to take care of themselves. They had to grow up early because they didn't have anyone taking care of them, that kind of thing. Maybe we could see then that as we adjust to our environment, it impacts our personality as well, right? So you're going to see down here in these peripheral components, external influences, the people that we spend time around impact our personality as well. So maybe we start off with a personality that's based on our genetics, and then as we grow up and we go through different experiences and we meet new people, that impacts our personality somewhat. When you see objective biography here, That's basically referring to your life experiences. So everything that you've experienced over your lifetime obviously impacts your personality. So we have a personality based on our genetics. Then our personality changes somewhat as we try to adapt to our environment. We also have our personality being influenced by our self-concept. So your self-concept is basically what you think about yourself and how you feel about yourself. So whether you typically like who you are and feel good about yourself, or whether you see yourself as a capable person or an intelligent person, or maybe you don't like yourself, you don't feel comfortable with yourself, you have a negative attitude towards yourself. And we could see how, for example, someone who has a very negative attitude towards themselves might become more introverted. Maybe they don't want to be around other people because they think that other people won't like them. They don't like themselves, right? That kind of thing. So your evaluation of yourself also impacts who you are. So basically what we're saying here is that you're born with a biological tendency toward certain personality traits. Then you adapt to your environment, you decide what you think about yourself, you have these experiences throughout your life, and other people are impacting you, and so that ultimately determines where you end up on your personality scale. So yes, there is room for personality to change and grow somewhat, although we know that we are born with a predisposition towards certain personality traits, according to McCrae and Costa. Very good. So then what kind of research has been done on these personality traits? So we already said that research suggests that these personality traits are found in the majority of cultures and that they are fairly stable throughout lifetime, so they don't change that much, right? But what other research has been done? Well, we were talking about how personality is relatively consistent across culture, and this is true. So extraversion, neuroticism, agreeableness, openness, conscientiousness, we find those traits in all cultures. However, there are some differences between cultures, obviously, and so your culture, perhaps, it determines how you express your personality. So maybe you're extroverted and someone from another culture is extroverted, but the way you show your extroversion depends on what is considered acceptable in that culture, right? Maybe you are very conscientious and someone in another culture is very conscientious, but the way that you express that is different based on the cultural norms. So yes, the basic traits are similar across cultures, but the way that society allows or encourages us to show those might change a little bit. Also, let's theorize about traits in academics for a second. So, if we know anything about academic success, we know that people who are willing to work hard and to be organized are most likely to be successful. So then we would probably predict that individuals who are conscientious would do better in school. Maybe individuals who are low on neuroticism might do better if they're able to kind of handle their emotions and control their emotions a little bit. Maybe if we could just theorize about this for a second, we could see that personality is associated with academics. So then let's look at what the research has actually found. So this is very interesting. So what they found was that conscientiousness predicted GPA in high school and in college. What that means is that an individual's performance is very closely related to their own work ethic, which I think that deep down we know this is true, but it's nice to see some research suggesting this is the case, right? But what we also found is that conscientiousness was not related to SAT scores. So let's think about that for a second. Your performance in school is predicted by your conscientiousness, but your SAT scores are not. Perhaps then, when you're talking about an SAT test that you really can't prepare for, I mean you try to prepare for, but it's difficult to prepare for, maybe it really only measures ability level. But if we're talking about something like being in high school or being in college for years and making sure that you come to class and that you take notes and that you study and that you put forth the effort, that is related to conscientiousness and it is related to your grades. So then we know that sometimes, and I've seen this over and over again throughout my teaching career, there will be students who maybe didn't do so hot on standardized testing and that kind of thing, but they come and they work hard and they have good grades. On the other hand, I've seen individuals who had incredibly impressive scores on standardized tests, but then struggled in college and weren't as successful. So the take-home message here, to be an encouragement to you, is that your effort really plays a huge role in your outcome here, especially when we're talking about performance in school. We have research here to support that. So being conscientious is a good thing here. So what about our emotions? What about how we feel? Well, I told you briefly, I mentioned earlier that there's research to suggest that individuals who are extroverted also report being happier or having more positive mood. And individuals who are neurotic or high in neuroticism report having more negative mood. That is true, but that's not the entire story. So what we see is, part of it is your personality, but also part of it is the way that you process information, okay? So without going into great detail here, what we see is that working memory and these other cognitive processes play a role in your experience. What they found was that individuals who have this high processing speed, who think through things very quickly, they're less likely to be negatively impacted by neuroticism, right? It doesn't really hurt them. Maybe they have a personality that predisposes them toward being anxious and worry about things, but if they process information so quickly that they're only thinking about the logic and not letting the emotion become a part of it, then they're able to be successful. So it's not just personality, but it's also the way you think and the way that you solve problems. So generally speaking, people who are extroverted do tend to report more positive mood. People who are neurotic do tend to report more negative mood. But it's not just about personality. There's also a way that you process problems and approach information that's also important. All right, very good. So as we're kind of summing up here, we are talking about trait theory. We'll continue to talk about trait theory next week, and we'll talk about another individual's take on trait theory, which is similar but a little bit different. We'll get into that next time. But trait theories in general are very high on generating research. As you've seen, a lot of research has been done here. High on parsimony. This is fairly simple, right? Boiling personality down to 5 things that can be described and measured pretty easily. That makes a lot of sense for us. It organizes the knowledge, what we already know, because there's a lot of different measures that were included in the initial factor analysis to help us understand what personality traits might exist. So it does include a lot of information in it. Moderate on falsifiability, so there are some aspects of this that can be disproven, but not all of it. It says moderate to low as a guide for practitioners and internal consistency. So sometimes we're going to see people that don't necessarily fit in the mold here as well as other people do. And you might be asking yourself, well, how do I help my client that is neurotic? How do I help a client who's not conscientious? How do I help a client become more agreeable? And so we don't have as much of that information from factor analysis as perhaps we might like. Okay. When we're talking about trait theory, there are some aspects of this that don't address all aspects of humanity. So when we talked about Freud and when we talked about Adler and we talked about these other theorists, we talked about all of their different views of humankind. McCrae and Costa, basically, it was a statistical thing here. So they didn't really talk about determinism versus free choice that much. I mean, we did see that there's some biology, so we have biology. We know that some of our personality is a genetic predisposition, but we don't really know, based on this, whether we determine it, whether we have free choice, or whether we don't have free choice. It doesn't talk a whole lot about optimism versus pessimism. It just is what it is based on statistics. You didn't hear me say anything about unconscious during today's lecture, so very much focus on conscious. And uniqueness, okay, follow me here. If Allport suggested that all individuals are different and there's no way to measure each individual's personality traits as compared to other personality traits, then this is the pretty much opposite argument here, that there are 5 traits, they're the same traits, and everyone has either a high or low level of them. Then that's really championing for uniqueness across individuals. Okay? Alright, so that is the end of lecture for today. This was just an introduction to trait theory. We'll continue to expand on this next week. If you have any questions or if you need anything, let me know. Don't forget about your activity for this week, and I will talk to you guys next time.